June 30th, 1944. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, Pacific Theater. The tropical darkness hung thick over Henderson Field like wet velvet. No moon. No stars visible through the cloud cover. Just absolute, suffocating blackness stretching across the Pacific night. Inside the operations tent, ground control radar operators watched their scopes with exhausted concentration. For months, they had tracked the maddening pattern. Lone Japanese bombers arriving after midnight, engines deliberately unsynchronized to create that distinctive rattling sound that earned them the nickname Washing Machine Charlie. The harassment raids served no major strategic purpose. A bomb here, a flare there, maybe destroy a parked aircraft if luck favored the attacker. But the real weapon was psychological. Sleep deprivation, constant alerts, the nerve-shredding whine of air raid sirens pulling exhausted soldiers from their cots night after night. Submarines had been dealing with Charlie for nearly 2 years. The sound of those unsynchronized engines became a torture device more effective than any conventional bomb. American P-70 night fighters, hastily converted Douglas A-20 bombers, scrambled regularly to intercept these nocturnal visitors. They rarely succeeded. The P-70s were too slow, too clumsy, their improvised radar systems too unreliable to catch the nimble Japanese raiders who knew every cloud formation, every escape route, every trick to evade the lumbering American interceptors. Tonight would be different. Tonight, the 6th Night Fighter Squadron was flying something new. Something the Japanese had never encountered before. Something that had been specifically designed for one purpose: to hunt and kill in total darkness. At 2:47 a.m., radar detected a contact inbound from the northwest, range 80 miles, altitude approximately 12,000 feet, speed consistent with a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the twin-engine medium bomber Allied forces called the Betty. The alert sounded, but this time only one aircraft scrambled. A massive shape, painted glossy black, rolled down the runway with a peculiar twin-boom silhouette that made it look like something from science fiction rather than military aviation. 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines roared to life with combined power exceeding 4,000 horsepower. The tricycle landing gear compressed, released, and the aircraft lifted into the darkness. The pilot was Lieutenant Dale Haberman. His radar operator was Flight Officer Raymond Mooney. Together, they crewed a Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the first operational United States warplane designed specifically as a night fighter. Ground control vectored them toward the contact. Mooney's eyes never left his SCR-720 radar scope, watching the green phosphorescent blip that represented their target. 60 miles, 50 miles, 40 miles. The Japanese pilot had no idea he was being tracked. No idea that invisible radio waves were painting him on a screen 40 miles away. No idea that something was closing on his position at 360 miles per hour. 30 miles, 20 miles. Haberman began a gentle climbing turn, positioning the Black Widow for an attack approach from slightly below and behind, exactly where the Betty's defensive armament had blind spots. Mooney called out ranges in the calm, almost methodical voice that night fighter crews developed through months of training. 15 miles, 12 miles, 10 miles. Targets steady on heading, no evasive maneuvers.
The Japanese crew still suspected nothing. At 5 miles, Mooney switched to the short-range tracking mode. The radar painted the target with precision. Haberman could see nothing visually. The Beatty was simply a darker shape against the dark sky. But the radar gave him everything he needed: range, bearing, altitude, closing speed. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. At 800 yards, less than half a mile, Haberman finally spotted his target visually. The faint blue exhaust flames from the Beatty's engines appeared like tiny stars against the black void. He adjusted his approach, placing the Black Widow directly astern, slightly below the bomber's tail. 600 yards, 500 yards, 400 yards. The Japanese crew never saw the Black Widow, never heard it approach over the sound of their own engines, never knew they were about to die. At 300 yards, Haberman triggered the Black Widow's primary armament, 4 20mm Hispano M2 autocannons mounted in the lower fuselage. The night erupted in fire. High-explosive incendiary rounds tore through the Beatty's thin aluminum skin at the rate of 600 rounds per minute. The bomber's fuel tanks, notoriously unprotected in Japanese aircraft design, ignited instantly. The engagement lasted 4 seconds. The Beatty transformed from an aircraft into a fireball. The explosion lit up the night sky like a miniature sun, briefly illuminating the Black Widow's sinister twin-boom silhouette before darkness reclaimed the Pacific. The bomber began its death spiral toward the ocean 4 miles below. No parachutes emerged, no survivors. Lieutenant Haberman and Flight Officer Mooney turned for home, their fuel tanks still 3/4 full, their ammunition bays barely depleted. Total mission time, 47 minutes. Time on target, less than 1 minute. They landed back at Henderson Field at 3:34 a.m. to find the entire base awake. Word had spread instantly. Ground control had watched the intercept on radar. The kill had been confirmed visually by observers on the ground who saw the explosion. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron had just scored the first P-61 Black Widow kill in the Pacific Theater. The hunt had begun. And for Japanese pilots who had terrorized Allied bases with impunity under cover of darkness, the rules of the game had changed forever. The night no longer belonged to them. Something was hunting them now. Something they couldn't see. Something they couldn't hear. Something that could track them through clouds, through darkness, through weather that grounded every other type of aircraft. They called it the Black Widow, and very few pilots who encountered it ever laughed again.
The story of the P-61 Black Widow began not in the Pacific, but in the dark skies over London during the Blitz of 1940. German Luftwaffe bombers had switched from daylight raids to night bombing after suffering catastrophic losses to Royal Air Force Spitfires and Hurricanes. Under cover of darkness, German bombers devastated British cities with near impunity. RAF night fighters, Bristol Blenheims and Bolton-Paul Defiants, hastily fitted with primitive radar, proved woefully inadequate. They were too slow, too poorly armed, and the radar systems were barely functional. Britain desperately needed a purpose-built night fighter, but British aircraft manufacturers were already operating at maximum capacity, producing day fighters and bombers. The British Purchasing Commission approached American manufacturers, hoping someone could design and build what Britain could not. Enter John Knudsen Northrop, Jack to everyone who knew him, founder of Northrop Corporation and one of aviation's true visionaries. In October 1940, Jack Northrop and his chief of research, Vladimir Pavlechka, met with British and American military officials. The requirements were daunting. The aircraft needed to carry at least 3 crew members: pilot, radar operator, and gunner. It needed heavy armament capable of destroying bombers quickly before they could escape into cloud cover. It needed operational endurance of at least 8 hours to patrol above potential targets. Most critically, it needed to carry the new SCR-720 airborne intercept radar, which was still under development. And it needed to be invisible at night. Northrop's team worked through the winter of 1940-1941, producing design after design.
The result was unlike any fighter aircraft ever built. Twin Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines in nacelles that tapered into twin tail booms connected by a central horizontal stabilizer. A central crew nacelle with stepped canopies providing exceptional visibility. 4 20mm cannons mounted low in the fuselage, their muzzles positioned far enough back that the flash wouldn't blind the pilot during night combat. A remotely controlled dorsal turret mounting 4.50 caliber machine guns, aimable by either the gunner or radar operator. The radar nose cone gave the aircraft an aggressive, predatory appearance. Combined with the twin boom configuration, it looked like nothing else in the sky. On January 30, 1941, the United States Army Air Corps awarded Northrop 2 contracts for XP-61 prototypes. By November 1940, Northrop had already defeated Douglas Aircraft Company's competing design. On December 5, 1940, the Army formally approved the P-61 design. The first XP-61 prototype flew on May 26, 1942. Test pilots reported excellent handling characteristics despite the aircraft's massive size. It was as large as medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell. Maximum speed exceeded 360 miles per hour. Range exceeded 1,000 miles. Service ceiling above 33,000 feet. And most critically, the SCR-720 radar could detect other aircraft from as far as 20 miles away under ideal conditions.
But there was a problem. The dorsal turret created severe buffeting when traversed at high speed. Early production P-61s had the turret removed entirely while engineers worked to fix the problem. Some squadrons would fly their entire combat tours without turrets, relying solely on the belly-mounted cannons. The Black Widow went through extensive testing at multiple facilities through 1942 and 1943. Engineers experimented with paint schemes. Olive drab over black underside failed. Searchlights detected it easily. Flat black performed better. But gloss black proved nearly invisible in searchlight beams, the reflective surface somehow making the aircraft blend into the night sky rather than stand out against it. By October 1943, production P-61As began rolling off the Northrop assembly line in Hawthorne, California. All combat aircraft were painted glossy black, a finish that gave the aircraft its fearsome appearance and its name. Black Widow, the venomous North American spider Lactroductus mactans, a creature that hunts in darkness, a predator that builds webs invisible to its prey, a killer that strikes without warning. The name fit perfectly. The 348th Night Fighter Squadron at Orlando Army Air Base, Florida, received the first production P-61s and began training crews in late 1943. Night fighter operations required skills that bore little resemblance to daylight combat. Day fighter pilots relied on visual identification, formation flying, and split-second maneuvering. Night fighter crews operated alone, relying on instruments and radar in conditions where visual references simply didn't exist. The psychological demands were extraordinary. Pilots had to trust their instruments completely, even when every instinct screamed that the instruments were wrong. Radar operators had to interpret glowing green blips on cathode ray tubes and translate them into 3-dimensional intercept solutions while the aircraft maneuvered in total darkness. The crew coordination was unlike anything else in aviation. The pilot flew the aircraft and fired the fixed cannons. The gunner operated the dorsal turret when installed. The radar operator managed the SCR-720 system, tracked targets, computed intercept courses, and could also aim and fire the dorsal turret. All 3 crew members communicated constantly over the intercom, their voices calm and methodical, even during high-speed intercepts where any error could mean death. Training emphasized the radar above all else. The SCR-720, Searchlight Controller Radar, developed by Bell Telephone Laboratories and manufactured by Western Electric, was revolutionary but temperamental. It consisted of 2 modes: search mode for long-range detection and tracking tracking mode for close-range attack solutions. In search mode, the operator watched a circular display showing returns out to roughly 16 miles. Targets appeared as bright spots on the scope. By adjusting the antenna sweep, the operator could determine bearing and approximate range. Once a target was identified, the operator switched to tracking mode, which provided precise range, bearing, and altitude information. The minimum range was roughly 300 yards. Below that distance, the radar was useless. Pilots had to rely on visual identification for the final approach. Hence the night vision binoculars mounted in Black Widow cockpits. These weren't electronic devices like modern night vision goggles, but purely optical instruments with wide apertures designed to gather maximum available light. The crews trained for months before deployment. Night formation flying, radar intercepts, instrument approaches in zero visibility, emergency procedures for everything from single-engine failure to radar malfunction, combat scenarios where radar operators talked pilots through intercepts while the pilot saw absolutely nothing outside the cockpit except darkness. The first combat-ready squadrons deployed in early 1944. The 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons shipped to England in preparation for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The 6th, 418th, 419th, and 421st Night Fighter Squadrons headed to the Pacific Theater. They arrived at forward bases to find skepticism bordering on hostility from veteran units flying older aircraft. The P-61 was huge, much larger than any fighter they'd seen. Some pilots called it a flying boxcar. Others questioned whether something that big could possibly be an effective fighter. The Black Widow crews were about to prove them wrong.
Guadalcanal, June 1944. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron arrived with 12 P-61B Black Widows, replacing their aging P-70s. The P-70s had been virtually useless against Japanese night raiders. Too slow, too heavy, radar too primitive. Japanese Betty bombers and Kawasaki K-48 Lily light bombers had harassed Allied positions with near impunity for 2 years. The Japanese night harassment tactics, washing machine Charlie raids, had evolved into a psychological warfare weapon. Lone bombers or small formations would arrive after midnight, their engines deliberately unsynchronized to create maximum noise and sleep disruption. They'd drop a few bombs, maybe destroy a parked aircraft, certainly keep thousands of soldiers awake and on edge. After that first kill, on June 30th, the pattern changed dramatically. Night after night, Black Widows patrolled above Allied bases. Their radar allowed them to track incoming Japanese aircraft from distances the raiders never imagined possible. Ground control radar would detect contacts at extreme range and vector Black Widows toward intercepts. The P-61 crews would track their targets through total darkness, clouds, and weather that grounded every other type of aircraft. Japanese pilots began reporting strange encounters, aircraft that appeared out of nowhere, fighters that somehow tracked them through cloud layers, deadly accurate fire from positions that should have been impossible to achieve in darkness. Some Japanese pilots claimed Americans had developed a supernatural ability to see in the dark. Others theorized some kind of infrared detection system. None suspected the truth, that invisible radio waves were painting them on radar screens 40 miles away, giving Black Widow crews complete situational awareness while Japanese pilots flew blind. By August 1944,
Japanese night raids against Guadalcanal had virtually ceased. The handful of bombers that still attempted missions faced a grim reality. The survival rate had plummeted. Too many bombers simply failed to return. Too many crews vanished into the Pacific darkness without trace or explanation. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron moved forward as Allied forces island-hopped across the Pacific. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Everywhere they went, Japanese night raids diminished or stopped entirely. Intelligence officers interrogating captured Japanese pilots discovered a disturbing pattern. Some pilots absolutely refused to fly night missions. When pressed for reasons, they described an almost supernatural fear of the black aircraft. Some claimed it was invisible. Others said it could appear and disappear at will. A few insisted it wasn't an aircraft at all, but some kind of demon or vengeful spirit. The psychological impact far exceeded the actual number of kills. By January 1945, Japanese commanders largely abandoned night harassment raids in areas where Black Widows operated. The risk-to-benefit ratio had inverted completely. One incident captured the Black Widow's psychological warfare value perfectly. In July 1944, a Japanese Betty bomber crew reported being attacked by the Black Ghost over Saipan. They described the P-61 appearing suddenly out of darkness, firing a devastating burst that killed the tail gunner and set the port engine ablaze. The bomber's pilot dove for sea level, desperately trying to evade. The Black Widow stayed with them through every maneuver. The Japanese pilot later said it felt like being hunted by a predator that could see perfectly while he flew blind. When the Betty finally crash-landed in the water, the surviving crew members were picked up by a U.S. submarine. During interrogation, the pilot, a veteran with 3 years combat experience, stated flatly that he would never fly at night again, regardless of orders or consequences. He kept his word. When ordered on another night mission 2 weeks later, he reported sick. When ordered again, he requested transfer to a day fighter unit. When that request was denied, he attempted to sabotage his own aircraft. He was relieved of flying duties and sent to a ground assignment. One encounter with the Black Widow had psychologically destroyed an experienced combat pilot.
As Black Widow squadrons gained experience, they developed increasingly sophisticated tactics. The standard intercept procedure began with ground control radar detecting an inbound contact. The controller would vector a patrolling Black Widow toward the contact, providing heading and altitude information. Once the Black Widow's own radar acquired the target, typically at 12 to 16 miles, the crew took over the intercept independently. The radar operator would track the target while computing an intercept course that positioned the Black Widow astern of the enemy aircraft, ideally in the blind spot below and behind. This required complex mental calculations performed in real time while the aircraft maneuvered in total darkness. Many radar operators developed an almost instinctive feel for three-dimensional intercept geometry. Once positioned astern, the pilot would close to firing range, typically 300 to 600 yards. At that distance, the 20mm cannons were devastatingly effective. Each cannon fired at 600 rounds per minute. A 2-second burst put 40 rounds into the target. High-explosive incendiary ammunition that turned most Japanese aircraft into fireballs. But experienced Black Widow crews didn't just shoot down aircraft, they hunted them. Pilot Carol Smith and radar operator Philip Porter, who would become the only American night fighter aces in the Pacific, developed a technique they called stalking. Instead of closing immediately for the kill, they would follow Japanese bombers for miles, watching their patrol patterns, learning their evasive tactics. Only when they had complete situational awareness would they close for the kill. This psychological warfare was deliberate. Japanese survivors would report being followed for extended periods before the attack came.
The knowledge that something was tracking you through the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, it was more terrifying than immediate attack. Some Black Widow crews became specialists in different types of intercepts. High-altitude intercepts against reconnaissance aircraft, low-level intercepts against torpedo bombers, weather intercepts through thunderstorms that grounded other aircraft, long-range intercepts far from friendly bases. The 548th Night Fighter Squadron, operating from Saipan and later Iwo Jima, developed expertise in intercepting formations of Japanese bombers. Intelligence had discovered that Japanese bomber formations typically flew strung out over 20 miles, with aircraft spaced several miles apart to reduce mid-air collision risk in darkness. Black Widow crews discovered they could intercept the lead bomber, shoot it down, and the trailing bombers would frequently jettison their bombs and turn for home rather than continue into the target area without their formation leader. A single kill could abort an entire raid. The tactic proved so effective that by mid-1945, Japanese bombers largely abandoned formation flying at night. Solo aircraft were even more vulnerable to Black Widow intercepts, but had better survival odds than formations where the lead aircraft was certain to be shot down.
What made the P-61 Black Widow so effective? The answer lay in the integration of multiple technological advantages. Radar advantage. The SCR-720 radar provided detection ranges far exceeding any Japanese night fighting capability. Japanese pilots relied on visual identification, which in Pacific darkness meant they couldn't see other aircraft beyond a few hundred yards at most. The Black Widow crew could track them from 16 miles away. This advantage was insurmountable. Speed advantage. While not the fastest fighter of the war, the P-61 could reach 366 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, faster than any Japanese bomber and comparable to most Japanese fighters. More importantly, it could maintain high speed during intercepts, while Japanese bombers typically cruised at speeds below 300 miles per hour. Armament advantage. 4 20mm cannons firing high-explosive incendiary ammunition with 200 rounds per gun. 4.50 caliber machine guns in the dorsal turret with 530 rounds per gun. Total firepower that could shred any Japanese aircraft in seconds. Range advantage. The P-61B could operate up to 1,200 miles from base with internal fuel. Extended range tanks pushed this beyond 2,000 miles. Japanese night raiders typically operated within a few hundred miles from their bases. Black Widows could intercept them far from home, where the raiders expected safety. Crew coordination. The 3-man crew provided redundancy and workload distribution impossible in single-pilot aircraft. If the radar failed, the pilot could continue on instruments while the radar operator troubleshot the problem. If the pilot became disoriented, a constant danger in night flying, the other crew members could talk him through recovery. All-weather capability. The Black Widow could operate in weather that grounded every other fighter. Thunderstorms, low visibility, cloud layers that blocked visual navigation. None of it mattered. The radar and instruments allowed operations in conditions that would be suicide for conventional fighters. Perhaps most importantly, the P-61 was specifically designed for its mission from the beginning. It wasn't a day fighter modified for night operations. It wasn't a bomber pressed into fighter service. It was built from the ground up to hunt and kill in darkness. By late 1944, the psychological impact of Black Widow operations exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Captured Japanese documents revealed that some units specifically prohibited discussion of the black aircraft because it damaged morale so severely. Pilots who survived Black Widow encounters frequently transferred out of night-flying units or requested ground assignments.
One particularly telling document, a diary captured from a Japanese bomber squadron commander, documented the deterioration of his unit's effectiveness through the summer of 1944. June 15, 1944. Night operations proceeding normally. Minor harassment of American installations continues with acceptable losses. July 8, 1944. 2 bombers failed to return from last night's mission. No radio contact, no known American fighters in the area. Unexplained. July 22, 1944. Another bomber lost. Crew reports being attacked by invisible aircraft. Pilot claims aircraft appeared suddenly, fired brief burst, disappeared into clouds. Bomber severely damaged, barely made it home. Crew demoralized. August 5, 1944. 3 bombers lost in 1 week. Survivors report encounters with black aircraft that can track them through clouds. Some pilots refusing to fly night missions, morale collapsing. August 19, 1944. Night operations suspended indefinitely. Cannot sustain current loss rates. Pilots terrified of the black aircraft. They call it death from darkness. Cannot continue. That squadron never resumed regular night operations. The Black Widow had achieved what months of previous night fighter operations had failed to accomplish: complete psychological dominance of the night sky. American intelligence officers dubbed this phenomenon Black Widow syndrome, a form of combat stress reaction specific to Japanese pilots who had encountered or heard about P-61 engagements. Symptoms included refusal to fly night missions, severe anxiety when discussing night operations, and, in some cases, complete psychological breakdowns requiring medical evacuation. The syndrome was so widespread that by January 1945, Japanese command structures had to rotate pilots between units more frequently to prevent the fear from spreading throughout entire air groups. Some Japanese pilots developed elaborate superstitions and rituals they believed might protect them from Black Widow attacks: flying at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, constant course changes, refusing to fly straight and level for more than 30 seconds. These tactics sometimes worked, but they also made effective bombing runs virtually impossible. The Black Widow was winning the night war not just by shooting down enemy aircraft, but by making Japanese pilots so fearful of night operations that they couldn't function effectively even when Black Widows weren't present.
August 14, 1945. The war was hours from official conclusion. Emperor Hirohito had recorded the surrender announcement to be broadcast the next day. But not all Japanese forces had received the news or believed it. Over Iwo Jima, near Okinawa, radar detected a lone contact approaching from the north. The 548th Night Fighter Squadron scrambled P-61B, serial number 4239408, call sign Lady in the Dark, piloted by Lieutenant Lee Kendall, with radar operator Lieutenant John Shearer. The contact was a Nakajima K-43 Hayabusa, Oscar to Allied forces, a nimble single-engine fighter. Ground control vectored Lady in the Dark toward the intercept. Kendall and Shearer tracked the Oscar through the darkness. The Japanese pilot seemed unaware he was being followed. When Lady in the Dark closed to firing range, Kendall armed his cannons and prepared to fire, but something made him hesitate. The war was ending. This might be the last air combat of World War II. Did he really need to kill this pilot? Kendall made a decision. Instead of firing, he closed to within 200 yards, dangerously close for a combat intercept, and turned on his landing lights. The effect was instantaneous. The Japanese pilot saw the massive Black Widow appear behind him, literally out of nowhere,
close enough that he could see the pilot's face in the cockpit. He panicked. The Oscar dove violently toward the ocean, attempting evasive maneuvers at wave-top height. Lady in the Dark followed easily, the P-61's superior power and speed allowing Kendall to stay with every desperate maneuver. The chase lasted 3 minutes. The Oscar's pilot threw his aircraft through every evasive tactic he knew: violent turns, altitude changes, speed variations. Nothing worked. The Black Widow stayed locked on his tail like a nightmare made real. Finally, disoriented from the violent maneuvering at extremely low altitude, the Oscar's pilot misjudged his height above the water. The aircraft's wing clipped a wavetop, the aircraft cartwheeled into the Pacific and exploded. Lady in the Dark turned for home. Kendall had scored a kill without firing a single shot. The next night, August 15th, technically after the war had ended, Lady in the Dark encountered another Japanese fighter, a Nakajima K-44 Tojo. Same scenario, same outcome. The Japanese pilot attempted to evade, became disoriented, and crashed into the sea. These were among the very last aerial kills of World War II, both achieved by psychological warfare rather than firepower. The Black Widow's reputation had become a weapon more deadly than bullets. When World War II ended, the P-61 Black Widow had compiled an impressive combat record: 127 confirmed aerial victories and 18 V-1 buzz bombs destroyed. These numbers seem modest compared to dayfighter kills. P-51 Mustangs alone shot down thousands of enemy aircraft. But the Black Widow's impact far exceeded its kill count. It fundamentally changed night-air combat from a matter of luck and visual acuity to a technological competition where American advantages in radar and aircraft design proved decisive. The Black Widow pioneered tactics and technologies that defined military aviation for the next 70 years. Radar-directed intercepts, crew resource management in multi-person fighter aircraft, all-weather operations, beyond visual range engagement. Modern fighter aircraft, from the F-4 Phantom II to the F-15 Eagle to the F-22 Raptor, all trace their operational concepts back to lessons learned from P-61 operations. The idea that a fighter could detect, track, and destroy enemy aircraft without ever seeing them visually? That concept was proven operationally by Black Widow crews in 1944-1945. The psychological impact proved equally significant. The Black Widow demonstrated that technological superiority could achieve strategic effects far beyond simple attrition. By dominating the night skies so completely, by instilling such fear in enemy pilots, the Black Widow achieved air superiority over Japanese night operations with relatively few aircraft and minimal losses. Only 706 Black Widows were built, a tiny production run compared to the tens of thousands of P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s. Yet the Black Widow's influence on military aviation doctrine was profound and lasting. After the war, P-61s continued serving in the newly formed United States Air Force until 1950, operating as all-weather interceptors, protecting American airspace during the early Cold War. Some remained in service until 1954 in specialized roles. One P-61C, serial number 433300, participated in the National Thunderstorm Project, helping scientists understand weather phenomena. Another served in Arctic cold weather testing at Ladd Field, Alaska. But most were scrapped. By 1960, only a handful remained in museums. Today, only 4 complete P-61 Black Widows exist, scattered in museums across the United States. The rest were cut up for scrap metal, their aluminum recycled into peacetime products. The Black Widow taught lessons that military planners continue studying today. Technology as force multiplier. A relatively small number of technologically superior aircraft achieved strategic effects far exceeding their numbers. The 706 Black Widows produced wielded influence comparable to fighter types produced in quantities 10 times greater. Psychological warfare. Fear proved as effective as firepower. Japanese pilots who never personally encountered a Black Widow were nevertheless affected by its reputation. The mere possibility of encountering the aircraft changed enemy behavior across entire theaters of operation. Mission-specific design. Aircraft designed specifically for their intended role outperform adapted or modified aircraft. The P-61, designed from the beginning as a night fighter, proved far more effective than converted bombers or modified day fighters pressed into night fighting roles. Crew resource management. The three-man crew concept, initially controversial, proved its worth. The distribution of workload among specialized crew members allowed operations in conditions where single-pilot aircraft simply couldn't function. Radar as game changer. The SCR-720 radar gave Black Widow crews situational awareness that Japanese pilots couldn't match. This technological advantage proved impossible to overcome through pilot skill or tactical innovation. Lieutenant Lee Kendall, who flew Lady in the Dark to those last 2 kills, later reflected on his experience in an interview conducted in 1989. "We never thought of ourselves as special. We were just doing the job we'd been trained for. But I remember the first time I realized what we represented to Japanese pilots. We captured a bomber crew after forcing them down near Iwo Jima. The pilot, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold a cigarette. He kept looking at our Black Widow parked on the airstrip like it was going to come alive and attack him. The interrogator told us the pilot had flown over 40 missions. He'd been shot at by anti-aircraft fire, attacked by day fighters, survived emergency landings, but encountering our P-61 had broken something inside him. He kept saying, 'Invisible death, over and over.' That's when I understood. We weren't just shooting down airplanes. We were destroying their will to fight." That was the Black Widow's true legacy. It didn't just hunt enemy aircraft, it hunted enemy morale. It dominated not just airspace, but the psychological space inside enemy pilots' minds. Japanese pilots who survived the war would later describe their experiences with consistent themes: the feeling of being hunted by something they couldn't see, the realization that their skills and experience meant nothing against an enemy with such technological advantage, the absolute helplessness of knowing you could be tracked through any weather, any darkness, any conditions where you thought you were safe. Some stopped laughing entirely, not just about night flying, about anything related to combat aviation. The Black Widow had shown them something they couldn't unsee: that human skill and courage meant nothing against sufficient technological superiority, that they could be tracked, hunted, and killed by an enemy they never even saw. That realization broke some of them permanently. The P-61 Black Widow flew combat missions for only 1 year, from June 1944 to August 1945. But in that year, it revolutionized night air combat, established American air superiority over Japanese night operations, and created a psychological impact that lasted long after the last aircraft was scrapped. The Japanese pilots who encountered it learned a lesson that modern military forces still study: that technological superiority, psychological warfare, and mission-specific design create advantages that courage and skill alone cannot overcome. They learned that lesson in the darkness, where something they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't fight was hunting them. They learned it from the Black Widow, and many of them never laughed again. In memory of all air crews who fought in the night skies of World War II, American, Japanese, British, and German. They flew into darkness armed only with courage, skill, and whatever technology their nations could provide.